What couldn't you do to a slave girl in ancient Rome? It might sound like an odd question, because, in principle, Roman masters could do nearly anything they pleased. Slave girls, like all slaves in Rome, were considered res, or property, legal objects with no rights of their own. They could be bought, sold, punished, or exploited in almost any way the owner saw fit. And yet, as Rome evolved, certain restrictions emerged, written first into contracts and later into law. These limitations weren't born from compassion in the modern sense, but often from concerns about social order, family reputation, or economic stability. Still, they offered some measure of protection to slave girls in a world that otherwise gave them none. Let's take a closer look at 5 things Roman masters were not allowed to do to their female slaves, at least in theory. First, there was a restriction on prostitution and other so-called shameful professions. In the early empire, especially when someone sold themselves or their child into slavery under contract, it was not uncommon to include the phrase ne serva prostituatur, a clause explicitly forbidding the master from forcing the slave girl into prostitution. By the reign of Hadrian in the 2nd century AD, this restriction had evolved into a legal standard, protecting all female slaves, and especially slave girls, from being sold or assigned to brothels. Later, in the Byzantine period, this protection extended even further. Slave girls could no longer be forced to perform on stage or play music in public. In Roman moral thinking, entertainers, especially actresses and female musicians, were considered morally tainted, viewed not much differently from prostitutes. So the issue wasn't necessarily about protecting the girl's dignity, but about protecting the master's reputation. Second, some slaves were legally shielded from the most brutal forms of labor, particularly work in quarries, mines, or the vast agricultural estates known as latifundia. These environments were notoriously harsh, with back-breaking work, minimal rest, and extremely high death rates. Educated or skilled slaves, such as secretaries, scribes, or tutors, were sometimes explicitly excluded from such assignments in their contracts, and this often included slave girls who had been trained for domestic or administrative tasks. Not for humanitarian reasons, of course, but because their owners didn't want to risk damaging a valuable investment. Third, and perhaps most surprisingly, Roman law eventually began to place limits on how violently a master could treat a slave. In 67 AD, the Lex Patronia forbade owners from throwing their slaves, including slave girls, to wild animals in the arena without official permission. A small but meaningful start. Under Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD, any master who abandoned a sick slave was required to take them back and provide care. If they refused, the slave girl was automatically freed. Hadrian, ruling in the 2nd century, took things further by outlawing the killing of a slave without cause. Then, under Antoninus Pius, 138 to 161 AD, a slave girl who suffered extreme mistreatment could flee to a temple and plead her case. If the cruelty was confirmed, she was removed from the master's control and became a public slave under state protection. Of course, none of this meant that violence disappeared. Beatings, branding, forced labor, all of that remained perfectly legal. But wanton cruelty, particularly if it was public and excessive, began to carry consequences, even when directed at a slave girl. Fourth, later imperial law sought to protect slave families, and by extension, slave girls who had children or partners, from being broken apart. While slave marriages weren't recognized as legally binding in the early Republic, the empire eventually saw the introduction of laws that forbade the separation of spouses and parents from their children. Under Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, marriages between slaves were officially acknowledged by the state. A striking shift, even if the law was later reversed. In practice, the motivation here wasn't entirely moral. Stable slave households, especially those involving slave girls raising children, were viewed as more productive and less prone to rebellion. Encouraging internal slave communities created generations of house-born slaves, born into captivity, raised within it, and less likely to run. And finally, there was a somewhat counterintuitive protection. A slave girl could not be freed without her consent. This applied especially to the elderly, the injured, or those who had voluntarily sold themselves into slavery in exchange for food, shelter, and long-term security. Occasionally, a master would grant freedom not as a reward, but as a way of cutting costs, releasing a sick or unproductive slave girl into the streets, where she would likely die. To guard against this, some contracts included a clause requiring the master to keep the slave unless they agreed to be freed. This protected vulnerable individuals, particularly slave girls who had entered servitude as a survival strategy, from being discarded under the pretense of benevolence. So, was ancient Rome a humane society? Not by any modern standard. These rules were exceptions, not the norm. Narrow protections built around reputation, utility, and control, not compassion. And the fact that such rules were considered progressive should tell you just how harsh the standard treatment truly was. What's your take? Were these laws a step forward, or just a smarter way to manage oppression? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you found this perspective compelling, give us a like and subscribe to support more content like this. Thanks for watching.